Golden dust drifts through a spotlight and lands on a torn painting, a black horse emerging from mist eyes, alive with secrets. Kneeling beside the shattered frame, young Emily's trembling fingers open an antique leather journal hidden in the canvas. Faded lines recount a girl vanished in 1903, while the horse's breath seems to ignite the lone candle. A distant mind wind howls merging with the animal's breath. No one can tell if it comes from the artwork or from behind her. In that instant, the boundary between memory and reality shatters. Hit the subscribe button now to join us and follow the upcoming storytelling episodes, full of mystery, emotion, and unforgettable moments. Before she found that painting, Emily thought she was just an ordinary girl in an ordinary town. Until the past began calling her name. Yorkshire, England. Late autumn. Rain strokes the stained glass windows of the Wentworth Art Gallery, a once glorious Victorian building that now breathes in hushed reverence. Inside, beneath vaulted ceilings and the dull glow of antique chandeliers, a man named Graham Thornwell walks the gallery's northern wing. He's in his 60s, thin, precise, and devoted to his work, like a monk to his relics. For 37 years, Graham has served as the gallery's caretaker, cataloging every brushstroke in the collection with ritualistic devotion. The gallery is quiet at this hour, save for the faint ticking of a brass pendulum clock. As he moves past the pre-Raphaelites and toward a lesser-visited alcove of forgotten romanticists, Graham notices something odd. A section of the wall usually home to 3 modest watercolor landscapes has changed. One of the paintings, the central one, has been replaced. Or, perhaps, added, but the frame is ancient, the dust on its molding undisturbed. He narrows his eyes. It's a painting he's never seen before. A dim, fog-laced scene, a little girl on horseback crossing a crumbling stone bridge. The horse is black, its mane windswept, its eyes strangely human. The girl wears a maroon cloak. Her hair is auburn, tied in a ribbon. Her expression, blank. Not joy, not fear, just a kind of ghostly serenity. Behind her, the landscape blurs into a misty void. The only thing clearly rendered is a broken fence at the far end of the bridge. Graham stares at it for a long minute, unnerved by a faint shimmer, an iridescent sheen across the surface of the canvas, as though light is leaking from within the painting itself. He checks the brass plaque beneath. No title, no date, no artist, just a number 5. His brows furrow. There is no number 5. He mutters, voice low and shaking. The gallery's private collection, meticulously archived, contains 4 known works by an anonymous artist believed to have painted under a false name in the 19th century. Those 4 had been kept sealed for decades. The 5th was rumored never confirmed. The legend was more myth than matter until now. Graham pulls out his leather-bound logbook, flipping rapidly through pages filled with tightly penned notes. There's nothing about a 5th painting. No recent acquisitions, no curatorial entries, no records from transport or storage. He backs away, heart thudding. The overhead light flickers. For a moment, he imagines the girl in the painting turning her head slightly toward him. But when he blinks, the image is unchanged. That evening, a hastily assembled meeting convenes in the gallery's inner conference room. Rain lashes the windows as 3 art historians, Dr. Huxley, a cold-eyed provenance expert, Marianne Bell, a skeptical conservator from London, and Simon Clark, a museum director with a cynical streak, huddle around a printed reproduction of the painting. It has to be a forgery, Huxley says flatly. The brushwork is too precise, the varnish, too degraded to be fresh. But where did it come from? Marianne leans in, narrowing her gaze at the high-resolution detail. Look here, she says, pointing at the folds of the girl's cloak. This is craquelure consistent with 19th century linseed oil. But the pigment, this specific vermilion shade, was banned in Britain after 1889. Exactly, Simon mutters, which would place it around, 1870s, possibly earlier. But that doesn't explain the signature. He flips the image over. Scrawled in charcoal on the canvas backing is a childlike handwriting. To E. Come back before winter. They fall into silence. That's not a title, Marianne whispers. It's a message. As they argue over materials and myths, Graham stands quietly by the window, a mug of cold tea untouched in his hand. He's thinking of something else. Something personal. That afternoon, when he'd first stared at the girl in the painting, a jolt of recognition had struck him like lightning. The high cheekbones, the tilt of her chin, the defiant calm. It wasn't just familiar. It was identical. The girl in the painting was a mirror of his 7-year-old granddaughter, Emily. He hadn't said anything, not yet. Not to his daughter, not to the scholars. But the image haunted him. Later that night, when he sat Emily down for supper, he couldn't help staring at her from across the table. Her freckles, her ribbon, her solemn silence. "Did anyone paint you at school, Em?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She looked up, chewing her fish fingers thoughtfully. "No," she said, then paused. "But I saw a horse today." Graham froze. "Where?" "In the painting, at your work." He dropped his fork. You've been there." Emily shrugged. "No, just in my dream." He was sad. The next morning, Graham returned to the gallery early. He entered the alcove again alone and found the painting exactly where it had been. Yet something was different. The bridge stones beneath the horse's hooves looked darker, wetter, almost bleeding. He leaned closer, pressing his palm to the frame. The surface was cold. Not cold like wood in winter, but cold like something waiting. Back in the curatorial lab, Marianne ran tests on the paint composition. The data returned without explanation. One pigment, burnt sienna, showed no known chemical structure. The spectrometer couldn't read it. "Impossible," she muttered. "This pigment doesn't exist." Later that afternoon, the gallery's internal network received an anonymous email. The subject line, "You finally found her." Attached was a single image, the same painting but photographed a century ago, hanging in a parlor room. The photograph bore a timestamp dated 1901. Simon called the sender's domain. Disconnected. The metadata was wiped. As tension builds, suspicion spreads. Dr. Huxley begins doubting his own expertise. Simon drinks more. Marianne requests to move the painting into isolation, but every time they try to remove it from the wall, the alarms trigger despite being disabled. And in the background, Graham watches Emily more closely each day. She begins to hum melodies she never learned. Sketches horses in charcoal. One day she brings him a folded paper with 5 names written on it, none of them hers. "Where did you get this?" he asks. "I didn't get it," she says. "I remembered it." That night, Graham dreams of the painting. Only this time he's standing on the bridge. Emily is on the horse, reaching for him. And the sky behind her is not fog, but flame. He wakes in a panic, gasping for air, and realizes something has shifted. The girl in the painting. Her gaze is no longer straight ahead. She's looking at him. At this point, the gallery begins receiving inquiries from collectors, some citing the 5th painting as an artifact of legend. One even offers £5 million. But Simon refuses, disturbed by rumors of the so-called 5th curse, a long whispered tale about a series of Victorian-era disappearances tied to 5 unnamed children, each linked to an anonymous series of portraits. The team digs deeper. In a dusty corner of the Yorkshire town hall, Marianne uncovers a long-forgotten register, the 5 Lost. It lists 5 children reported missing between 1870 and 1890. The last entry, Eleanor Whitcomb, age 7, last seen near Blackmore Bridge. Under distinguishing features, often seen riding a black horse with no saddle. Said she could see light in broken things. Marianne reads the passage aloud, eyes wide. Graham drops the page. Emily's middle name is Eleanor, and now the countdown has begun. 4 paintings known, 1 reappeared. And no one knows where or when the 6th will arrive. But all of them sense it. There's something unfinished, something watching. And the bridge in the painting is growing longer. Stone by stone, night by night. Just beyond the frame, the rain had softened overnight, leaving streaks along the windows of the Thornwell residence that caught the dawn light like veins of silver. Outside, the moorland exhaled a low mist, stretching in quiet tendrils across the garden. Emily stood barefoot at the edge of her bedroom rug, her small hands trembling slightly as she stared into the mirror, not at herself, but at something just behind her, or within her, or within the glass. The mirror reflected what should have been a perfectly ordinary girl of 7 russet hair and loose braids, pale skin lit with the warmth of childhood, and eyes too large for a face so young. But this morning, something in her gaze was different. Not fear, exactly, something worse. Recognition. Emily blinked. So did her reflection. But a beat too late, like it had waited to see her move first. Downstairs, Graham stirred milk into tea with a distracted hand. The spoon clinked. He hadn't told his daughter about the painting. He hadn't told anyone what Emily said. The gallery board was keeping everything quiet until they could validate its provenance. And yet he knew instinctively this wasn't a mystery to solve with dates and x-rays. This was a wound. A buried one. And something had begun to bleed through. From upstairs, the floorboards creaked. Graham looked up as Emily descended the staircase slowly, her hand tracing the carved rail like she was learning the shape of the house all over again. "Morning, love," he called gently. She didn't answer. just stared past him toward the window, toward the fog. The nightmares had begun 3 nights ago. At first she couldn't describe them, only said they were cold. But now, every morning she woke crying silently, hands clenched into fists. When her mother asked what was wrong, she simply said, "The horse came back." Graham watched her now as she picked at her toast. The skin beneath her eyes had a faint bluish tint, like bruises without a cause. Her drawings, always imaginative, had taken a new turn. Gone were the butterflies and birds, replaced with eerie landscapes, stone bridges over chasms, forests without leaves, dark horses with too many eyes. Last night he'd found one crumpled in the waste bin with a note scribbled beneath it. He says it's not finished. He hadn't asked. Didn't need to. Later that day, while her mother took a work call, Emily retreated to the attic, her favorite space. It was cluttered with boxes of old books, a cracked globe, a moth-bitten curtain that smelled of lavender and age. She set up her drawing board in the far corner, where the only light came from a circular window partially fogged by time. The room was utterly still, except her pencil. It moved like it had memory. No plan, no sketch, just swift, almost frantic lines. She barely looked down, her eyes fixed ahead as if copying something from the air. Within minutes, a scene emerged. A girl, her clearly standing alone in the middle of a vast moor, her hands outstretched, calling for something across the wind. Behind her, a figure on horseback. The horse's mane flowed into smoke. The rider was faceless. She dropped the pencil. Breathing hard, Emily stood and backed away from the paper. Her gaze landed on a box marked Grandpa's Books. She pulled the lid free. Inside, nestled among fading covers, was a small velvet pouch. Drawn by some instinct she didn't understand, she opened it. Inside was a pendant, copper oval-shaped with a dark red gem at its center. As she lifted it, the light in the room shifted. And just for a moment, she heard the horse's breath. Wet. Close. The attic door slammed behind her. Downstairs, Graham froze mid-sentence in a phone call. He heard the thump. Dropping the receiver, he rushed up, calling her name. When he found the attic door, it wouldn't budge. He kicked it once, twice, until the old lock snapped. Emily stood in the middle of the room, unharmed. But her drawing was gone. Only a blank page remained. She looked up at him. "He took it," she whispered. "Who?" "The boy on the horse." That night, her mother watched over her as she slept. But Emily's dreams were growing more intense. She began speaking in her sleep, whispers in a voice that didn't sound entirely like hers. Fragments of an old dialect, hints of names long buried. She spoke of bridges collapsing, of footsteps following her through fog, of someone called Eleanor who couldn't go back. The next morning, Graham entered her room early. She was awake already, standing before the mirror. Her eyes met his in the reflection. "She says I'm part of the painting now," Emily said calmly. "But she's trapped. I have to finish what she started." "Who is she, Emily?" "The girl in the red cloak." Graham's throat tightened. He crouched beside her, grasping her shoulders gently. "You're not in danger, sweetheart. It's just a painting. Just paint on canvas." She looked at him, not with fear, but with something older, sadder. "No, Grandpa, it's a door." The days that followed were a slow unraveling. Emily stopped eating as much. She began to speak less during the day, but scribbled furiously in the margins of her books. Strange, looping runes began to appear in her sketches, symbols no one could translate. Her teachers called home, concerned. She stopped responding when spoken to, except to the mirror. On Thursday evening, Graham walked past her room and heard her laughing softly. He paused at the door. Inside, she was sitting in front of the mirror again. But this time, she was talking to someone. "What do you mean the bridge is longer now?" she asked, voice small. A pause. "No, I don't want to fall again." Another pause, then laughter. But not hers. Something dry, hollow, echoing like wind through stone. Graham opened the door quickly. No one was there. Just Emily staring at her reflection, which no longer mirrored her exactly. Her eyes in the glass were slightly out of sync. The pendant she'd found in the attic now hung around her neck, pulsing faintly in the dark. He reached for it. She recoiled. "Don't," she whispered. "It keeps me safe." "Until the 5th painting is complete." Graham stepped back. "There's only one painting, Emily." She shook her head slowly. "No, there were always 5. But one was hidden." He left the room in silence, heart pounding. That night, he reopened the gallery's archives. The so-called 5th painting had appeared without provenance. But what if that wasn't the beginning? What if it was the return? He found an old ledger in the back of the gallery's storage vault, dated 1891. A list of lost works, anonymous commissions. The fifth entry had been crossed out in thick red ink. Commission number 5. Girl with horse on bridge. Refused for exhibition. Claimed subject escaped canvas. Next to it, a note. Removed from registry. Do not display. Unfinished. Dangerous. That word hit him like a blow. Unfinished. Back at the house, Emily had taken out her drawings again. This time, she pinned them around her room. Dozens. Each one different, but all shared one common element. A bridge. It appeared in every piece. Sometimes broken. Sometimes pristine. Sometimes submerged in water. But always present. And in the background, the girl in the red cloak. Always alone. Always riding. Emily stood in the center of the room, arms slightly raised, as if listening to something beneath the floorboards. Her mother opened the door. "Honey, are you okay?" Emily turned slowly. "Can you hear it too?" she asked. Her mother frowned. "Hear what?" "The hooves. They're getting louder." Outside, the wind began to howl. And in the mirror, the girl in red finally smiled. The wind howled that night like something ancient had remembered its name. Rain danced against the glass roof of the gallery's east wing, its rhythmic tapping masking the sharp staccato creaks of wood contracting against cold. The building stood as it always had, stoic moored in the silence of its stone bones. But something was shifting in its core. And in the alcove where the fifth painting had hung, untouched for over a week, the tension finally broke. Graham had stayed late ostensibly to inventory recent donations. But in truth, he was watching the painting, watching how the shadows around it moved when they shouldn't, how the light over it flickered no matter how many times he changed the bulbs. Something in the air had thickened, a kind of stillness before collapse. He stood 5 paces back, hands clasped behind him like a mourner, when the painting began to tremble. It started with a whisper of canvas, a subtle warping of the frame like it had inhaled. Then the lower hook slipped. The top right corner sagged. Graham took a cautious step forward, and then it dropped. The frame hit the marble floor with a sharp wooden crack that echoed through the corridor like a shot. The glass didn't shatter, but the canvas tore along one edge, revealing something wedged behind it. Yellowed parchment, folded once brittle with age. Graham knelt down. His hand hovered over the paper like it was hot. He didn't touch it at first. He looked up at the painting, which now lay flat face up, the girl on horseback, staring skyward, as if finally released. Then slowly, reverently, he slid the paper free. It was a journal page, possibly more. A leather-bound corner peeked out from deeper inside the frame. He removed the backing panel completely and retrieved a thin, tattered booklet, the spine barely held by its stitches. The initials E.W. were carved in the lower corner. He opened it. The ink had faded in places, but the words were still legible, delicate cursive, the kind taught in a time when handwriting was a kind of virtue. The date on the first page stopped his breath. October 17th, 1903. The first line read, "They won't believe me, but I know what I saw on Blackmore Bridge. The horse had no shadow, and the girl was not alive." He read on his hands, trembling. "Her name is Eleanor. She comes when the fog is thickest. She rides alone, and yet the bridge echoes with 2 sets of hooves. I followed her once. I nearly didn't come back." Graham swallowed hard. The name Eleanor. It was familiar. Too familiar. He turned the page. "She told me the painting is a cage, that they trapped her inside because she knew too much. I asked who they were. She said the ones who painted me. Who..." He closed the journal, heart hammering. The girl wasn't just a subject. She was a prisoner, and suddenly he knew exactly who needed to see this. Emily sat curled beneath the bay window at home, the pendant still around her neck, her hands streaked with graphite. She hadn't drawn in over a day. The voices had gone quiet. Not gone, just quiet. Watching. Waiting. When Graham walked in with the journal, she looked up slowly as if she'd been expecting it. He knelt beside her and handed it over. She didn't speak, just opened to the first page and began to read. The room dimmed as clouds blanketed the sun. The only light came from the sconce above the window, casting a golden cone over the journal's pages as Emily turned them slowly, reverently. The air thickened. Her fingers traced the ink like she was remembering it, not reading it. Graham sat silently watching her expression shift. Curiosity, recognition, and then fear. She flipped the page. "They say I was lost, but I was taken. I don't remember how I got inside the painting, only that it was cold and quiet and full of eyes." She whispered the sentence aloud, and the light flickered. Emily looked up at her grandfather, her eyes wide, filled with something deeper than confusion. "She's still in there," she said. "In the painting." Emily shook her head. In me, Graham didn't speak. He couldn't. His thoughts raced. What was happening to her? What did the pendant, the drawing of the dreams mean? She turned to the final entry. They think I ran away, but I left something behind. If someone finds it, they can set me free. But they have to finish the bridge. Emily stared at that last sentence for a long time. The room seemed to pulse. What does that mean? Graham finally asked. Emily closed the book slowly. It means it's not over. The next morning, Emily didn't go to school. Instead, she and Graham returned to the gallery before it opened. He'd stayed awake all night reading and rereading the journal, trying to fit its revelations into the dry framework of provenance and art history. But the facts didn't hold. This wasn't about facts. They approached the alcove together. The fifth painting lay on a felt-draped easel, now cracked but intact. Emily stood before it, silent. Her fingers twitched at her side like they wanted to reach for something, chalk maybe, or a brush, but she just stared. She knows I read it, she murmured. Graham knelt beside her. Who does? Eleanor. She's awake now. She stepped closer. The pendant at her throat glowed faintly as she extended one hand toward the canvas. Not touching, just hovering. Her breath slowed. The girl in the journal? The one who saw Eleanor? Her name was Rose. Graham blinked. How do you know that? Emily didn't answer. Then slowly, she lifted the journal, opened it to the back cover. Folded within was a single slip of paper. Neither of them had noticed before. She pulled it out carefully. It was a charcoal sketch, faded but clear. A young girl on a hill sketching something in the distance. At her feet, the beginnings of a bridge, unfinished, leading nowhere. Rose had begun a drawing Eleanor couldn't finish. Emily turned back to the painting. I have to find where it ends. That night, Graham made a fire in the study and placed the painting under warm light. Emily sat cross-legged in front of it, the journal beside her sketchpad in her lap. Her eyes didn't blink as she stared at the image. Then slowly she began to draw. Not copy, continue. Her lines were swift, deliberate. From the far edge of the bridge in the painting, she extended stones, one after the next, toward a shadowed gap beyond the canvas. In her sketch, the bridge grew longer, stable. And at its end, she drew a door. Behind her, the mirror in the hall shifted. The reflection showed the room as it was, except the painting. In the mirror, it looked different, brighter. The girl on the horse was closer to the edge now, closer to stepping off the canvas. Emily kept drawing. In the fireplace, the flames flared. A gust of wind rattled the window. And then the doorbell rang. Graham jumped. No one should be visiting this late. He opened the door. No one was there. But at his feet, wrapped in brown cloth, lay a single item. Another journal. Older. The leather nearly dissolved by time. On the first page, in ink blacker than should have survived, was a line. If you are reading this, then the fifth has returned, and she will not go back quietly. Graham slammed the door shut. Inside, Emily was crying. I can feel her, she whispered. She's angry. Graham crossed the room, took her hands. She's not here to hurt you. She doesn't know who she is anymore, Emily replied. That's what the bridge was for. It's not a way out. It's a memory. She lifted the pendant. This was hers. Graham looked at her, the firelight dancing in his tired eyes. Then we have to help her remember. She nodded. I have to go back into the painting. He blinked. What? I have to finish it. Not here. There. The mirror behind them pulsed once like breath against glass, and the bridge in Emily's drawing was now complete. A door stood open at the end, waiting. The stone bridge was older than the town itself, built sometime in the early 1700s by masons, whose names had long since eroded from memory. Blackmore Bridge stretched over a gnarled ravine like a forgotten thought, arched moss-draped and crumbling beneath centuries of mist and neglect. Locals whispered stories about the place, that it echoed when no one walked it, that animals refused to cross, that during certain moonless nights the sound of hooves could be heard without a horse in sight. Emily had never been there before, but as she approached it, she felt like she was returning to somewhere she'd always known. The morning was cold. Her breath came in puffs as she followed the muddy footpath from the town's edge, cutting through fields now grayed with frost. Graham walked a few paces behind, concern etched into his every movement. He hadn't wanted her to come, had insisted this was beyond them, that they should leave it to historians, or police, or priests. But Emily wouldn't listen. She knew the truth was here, and she needed to see it for herself. When the bridge finally came into view, time seemed to shift. The trees around the ravine leaned slightly inward, as if listening. The water below, usually no more than a trickle, was high and violent after weeks of rain. Wind howled between the stone supports like breath through teeth. Emily stepped onto the bridge slowly. Every footfall echoed longer than it should have. She reached the center and stopped. "This is where it happened," she said softly. Graham looked around. "How can you be sure?" "She told me," Emily whispered. She turned toward the side railing, running her fingers along the lichen-covered stone. There, carved faintly into the edge, were initials E.W., Eleanor Whitcomb. Graham murmured, remembering the journal. Emily nodded. Then, without another word, she began climbing over the railing. "Emily!" Graham shouted, rushing forward. She didn't hesitate. She dropped down to the narrow footpath beneath the bridge's arch, a ledge barely wide enough for her small frame. She crouched there, fingers pressing into the damp stone eyes, scanning. And then she saw it. Nestled in the crag, where two stones met, half buried by mud, twisted roots, and decades of rot, was a small shape wrapped in decayed cloth. She reached out, heart-hammering, and pulled gently. The fabric gave way with a soft tear, revealing something pale and brittle beneath. A bone, small, thin, and next to it, a lock of braided auburn hair tied with a faded maroon ribbon, exactly like hers. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The breath in her chest had frozen solid. Above her, Graham had gone deathly pale. He climbed down shakily, joining her in the narrow alcove beneath the bridge. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Graham reached for his phone. They called the authorities. Within hours, the ravine was flooded with blue lights, yellow tape, and the metallic clatter of evidence kits. Emily sat wrapped in a blanket beside Graham as police combed the area. She didn't speak. She watched. Eventually, a forensic team confirmed the remains were that of a young female child, approximately 7 years old. The bone structure was consistent with someone who had died over a century ago. The ribbon, they said, would be sent for chemical analysis, but it appeared hand-dyed, likely from the late Victorian period. A match to Eleanor Whitcomb, a girl listed as missing in 1903, a girl the town had long forgotten. The press caught wind of it the next day. Remains of missing girl found after 120 years, the headlines screamed. Ghost painting linked to historic disappearance. Cameras descended on the gallery. The fifth painting became the epicenter of a media storm. And Emily began to change. The house felt smaller now. Every room too quiet, every hallway too dark. Emily's mother tried to act normal pancakes for breakfast cartoons in the evening, but the lines around her eyes deepened daily. She couldn't explain what had happened to her daughter, and nothing terrified her more than not knowing. Emily spoke less, slept less. She spent hours alone sketching bridges. Always bridges. Sometimes whole cities of them looping into impossible geometry, each leading to a door marked with a number 5. One night, Graham found her in the study at 3 a.m., staring at the painting again. "She was real," Emily said without turning. He stepped beside her. "You prove that." Emily shook her head. "Not just Eleanor. The others. The ones who painted her. The ones who locked her in." Graham didn't understand. Not fully. But he felt the weight of something vast pressing down. "What did they want?" he asked. "To be remembered," Emily whispered. But only their version of the truth. Not hers. A week later, the police made it official. The bones belonged to Eleanor Whitcomb. DNA matched a distant relative in Sussex. The cause of death was undetermined, but trauma to the skull suggested a fall or a push. And just like that, history rewrote itself. But with it came a question no one could ignore. Why had the painting hidden a body, and who put it there? The painting was scanned again. X-rays revealed another anomaly, a layer beneath the visible image. When digitally removed, a second painting emerged. Same bridge, same horse, but no girl. In her place, 5 shadowed figures, cloaked and faceless, standing at the bridge's edge. Occult and allegory, no one could say. But Emily felt it, truth buried under varnish. Justice painted over. Secrets layered in oil and time. And now, a choice. Because the Whitcomb name was not just any name in Yorkshire. It belonged to one of the town's founding families. Wealthy, respected, untouchable. And it was that same family's estate that once owned the gallery. If it was proven that Eleanor had been murdered by someone in her bloodline, if the family had commissioned the painting to hide her story, it would destroy their legacy. Worse, it would destroy the gallery. And Emily's mother, her job, her life, her grants. All funded in part by the Whitcomb Historical Trust. Graham brought her the report that night. Quiet, his face ashen. "They've asked us not to speak," he said. Emily looked up from her drawing. "Who? The board? Your mother? The trust? And you?" she asked. He hesitated. "I want to protect you, but not her." He flinched. "It's complicated." Emily stood slowly. "No, it's simple." She walked to the painting. For the first time, her reflection in the glass lined up perfectly. No delay, no distortion. Just her and Eleanor. "What happens if I tell the truth?" she asked. "They'll say you're disturbed. That it's just a story. That you made it up." She nodded. "And if I lie, you'll be safe." Emily turned, "But she won't be free." That night, she returned to the bridge alone. She left a letter for Graham, told him not to follow, that she needed to do this herself. She arrived just after midnight, lantern in hand, breath clouding before her. The bridge was quieter than she remembered. No wind, no sound, just the soft creak of stone under her boots. She walked to the center and stood. Above her, the clouds parted just enough for moonlight to spill through, catching the frost along the railing, turning it silver. The lantern flickered. She set it down, pulled the journal from her coat, and opened to the final page. There was one line she hadn't read before. If someone finishes the bridge, I will remember who I was. Emily took out her drawing. The final bridge. The door at the end. She closed her eyes. And then she spoke. My name is Emily, but I remember Eleanor, and I will not forget her. A gust of wind tore through the ravine. The lantern went out, and for a second, only a second, the bridge was full of figures. 5, standing where no one should. Watching, then gone. Emily collapsed to her knees. She wasn't afraid. She felt lighter, as if something had passed through her. The ribbon in her hair unraveled and fell. The next day, Graham found her sleeping in the study, peacefully. The painting beside her was different. The girl was gone. The bridge was empty, but complete. He checked the back. The signature had changed, no longer anonymous. It read, Eleanor Whitcomb, 1903-2023. Emily told the truth. To the police, to the press, to anyone who asked. She spoke plainly, clearly, without shame. The trust revoked her mother's funding. The gallery board resigned. The bridge was declared a historic site. And Eleanor, she was buried. Properly. With her name, her story, and the ribbon Emily had given back. The truth had cost them. But it had also set something free. In her final drawing, Emily depicted herself not on the bridge, but beyond it. In a meadow, with no doors, no watchers, only light. The days that followed the truth felt like walking underwater. Emily moved through her home, her school, the streets of her town, as if through a haze. Silent, slow, submerged. Words came to her ears but rarely entered her mind. Faces blurred past her, some curious, others cautious. People whispered in supermarkets, stared too long on buses. A girl with a ghost in her skin was hard to ignore. But it wasn't the town's gossip that trapped her. It was the weight of knowing what had happened, who Eleanor had been, who she might be. The knowledge curled itself around her ribs, wound tight in the hollow behind her sternum. Each breath she took stretched it thinner, but it never tore. It held, until one night it didn't. It began with a scream, not hers, but the kind that rips through the veil of sleep and pulls you upright before you even remember you're alive. Emily sat bolt upright in her bed, drenched in sweat. Moonlight sliced through her curtains. Her throat burned from silence. Her hands gripped the sheets like they'd been pulling her out of something. And in the corner of the room, the mirror was fogged from the inside. She slid out of bed slowly, her legs trembling. Each step toward the mirror echoed louder than it should have. She stopped a foot away, watching as the fog cleared. Her reflection stared back. But it wasn't her. Not quite. The girl in the mirror wore the same nightdress, same braid, same eyes. But something behind them wasn't 12 years old, wasn't of this century, wasn't separate. The girl blinked. So did Emily, perfectly timed. And then the reflection tilted her head, just slightly. Not mockingly, but knowingly. Emily stepped back. Her legs gave way. The next morning, she didn't go to school. She didn't leave her room. She sat on the floor with her back against the door, hugging her knees, staring at nothing. Her breath was shallow. Her heart no longer panicked. It had surrendered. This wasn't something outside her. It wasn't a haunting. It was a remembering. It was a return. Later that day, Graham came to her room with toast and tea. He knocked once, then again. Nothing. Finally, he left the tray and sat outside her door. You're not alone in this, he said quietly. Not ever. Silence. I know it feels like you're breaking. But maybe that's how truth works. It breaks you before it frees you. Still nothing. And then soft. Barely audible. I don't want to be her. He leaned in. Who? Eleanor. The name hung between them like a thread. Why not? A pause. Because she died afraid. And angry. And alone. I don't want that to be the end of my story. Graham's voice cracked. It doesn't have to be. That evening, she left the house for the first time in days. Not to the gallery, not to the bridge, but to the old chapel at the edge of town. No one worshipped there anymore. The roof had partially caved. Ivy dripped from the stained glass windows. The pews were rotted through, but the bells still hung silent and waiting. Inside, under a beam of twilight filtering through fractured glass, stood someone Emily had called before, her only real friend. Her name was Noor, a girl with oil-streaked fingernails and too many bracelets. Quiet, careful, clever. The kind of girl who watched more than she spoke. who believed in ghosts not because she was afraid, but because she'd met too many people pretending they didn't exist. Emily found her sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor, sketching an abstract shape in charcoal on her notebook. Noor looked up and didn't smile. She just said, "Finally." Emily crossed the room and sat across from her. "I didn't know who else to talk to." "You don't have to," Noor replied, closing her book. "I already know." Emily frowned. "Know what?" "That you're scared of disappearing." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Noor leaned closer. "Whatever's happening, whoever you think you were, you're still here. And you get to choose what that means." Emily's voice was hoarse. "I don't think it's a choice anymore." Noor looked her dead in the eyes. "Then make it one." That night, Emily stood in front of the painting again, but she wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for herself. The gallery was closed. The room was dark. Only the emergency light above the exit cast a low amber glow across the canvas. The girl on the bridge was back, not in flesh, but in presence. She wasn't painted anymore, not really. She was watching. Emily took a step closer. Her reflection in the glass aligned again. This time she reached out, fingers to fingers, surface to surface, and in that moment contact, her breath caught. Time fractured, and suddenly she was inside. Not metaphorically, not in a dream, but inside the painting. She stood on the bridge stone cold beneath her feet. The sky above was swirling ash. The ravine below ran silent black endless. She turned. Behind her stood the girl, Eleanor. Same face, same eyes, same ribbon, and yet older. Angrier, hollow. Emily took a step forward. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked. Eleanor tilted her head. "I didn't. You followed." Emily swallowed. "I need to understand who I am, who you were." Eleanor stepped closer. "You already know." "No. I feel you. I remember pieces, but I don't understand." "Because you're afraid." Emily nodded. "Yes." A pause. Eleanor looked down. "I was afraid too. That they'd erase me. That I would become nothing. So I screamed." Emily felt the wind rise. Screamed into paint, into silence. They stood in stillness for a moment. Then Eleanor asked softly, "Do you forgive them?" Emily blinked. "The ones who painted over you?" Eleanor nodded. Emily looked away. "I don't know." Eleanor stepped closer. "Do you forgive me?" "For what?" "For clinging to you. For pulling you back." Emily felt her chest tighten. "I don't think I ever had a choice." "Maybe not," Eleanor said. "But now you do." When Emily opened her eyes, she was back in the gallery. Graham stood beside her. He didn't speak. She turned to him. "I saw her, not as a ghost, as a girl, as me." He reached for her hand. "She's not you," he said gently. But Emily shook her head. "She is, and she isn't. I carry her. But I choose what I become." Graham nodded, proud, terrified, in awe. That night Emily wrote a letter. To herself, to Eleanor, to anyone who needed it. It read, "I am not your silence. I am not your vengeance. I am the echo you left behind, and I choose to sing." Weeks passed. The media frenzy died down. The gallery reopened now with an exhibit called The Fifth Light. The painting remained, but something was different. The girl was no longer alone. At the far edge of the bridge, barely visible, a second figure had emerged. A girl in modern clothing, her hand outstretched, reaching back. Emily stood before it one last time. No mirror, no glass, just image and self. The girl in the painting didn't look back. She didn't need to, because Emily no longer feared becoming someone else. She had become herself, whole, and finally, free. The wind had softened by morning. In the village of Blackmore, the cold lingered like a quiet memory. Not yet winter, but no longer fall. The trees had shed the last of their gold, and the sun broke through the clouds in hesitant beams. For the first time in weeks, the weather did not feel haunted. Emily stood at the edge of the chapel green, staring at the row of chairs laid out before the old stone steps. She had chosen this place carefully. Not the gallery, not the bridge. Here where history had always spoken in whispers between pews, where names had been inscribed in hymnals and headstones. It felt right, like an echo waiting for its voice. She tightened her fingers around the folded notes in her hand, though she knew she wouldn't use them. Behind her, the air shifted. Graham stepped beside her, warm and solid, his presence saying what words could not. A few yards away, Noor stood with her hands in her coat pockets, eyes scanning the gathering crowd with quiet vigilance. They had come, more than she expected. Locals, tourists, journalists, historians. Curious faces, skeptical faces, familiar faces, and some who had avoided her for weeks, teachers' neighbors, even kids from school. There were murmurs of doubt, certainly, but also something gentler beneath them. The scent of curiosity, the possibility of belief. At precisely 10 o'clock, the bells of the chapel rang once. Emily stepped forward. The crowd silenced. She did not climb the steps. She did not stand above them. She stood with them, level, barefaced, steady. "I didn't come here to convince you," she began. Her voice was clear, though her heart beat loud in her ears. I came here because I know what truth costs. A ripple of motion in the crowd. Cameras shifted, eyes narrowed. My name is Emily Thornwell. I'm 12 years old, and I'm here to tell you the story of a girl who was erased. She paused. She was 7. Her name was Eleanor Whitcomb. In 1903, she disappeared near Blackmore Bridge. The official story was that she ran away. But she didn't. She was taken, silenced, buried. She unfolded the page in her hand. Not to read it, but to show them the drawing. It was the bridge completed, whole. This drawing came to me in pieces, in dreams, in whispers. I didn't understand it at first. I thought it was just a mystery to solve. But it wasn't. She looked around, locking eyes with the people in front. It was a memory, her memory, and mine. Someone gasped. Others murmured, I know it sounds impossible. I know what it means to say this out loud. But I need you to hear me. She held up the second sheet, Eleanor's original journal page. She left her voice behind, buried in a painting, hidden under layers of silence. But it survived. Emily took a breath. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but release. When we found her body, it wasn't just bones. It was proof of what was done to her, of what they tried to hide. The sky above cleared slightly, the sun warming the green. And maybe you don't believe in ghosts. Maybe you think this is fantasy. But the truth doesn't need your permission to exist. She folded the paper. Eleanor wasn't a myth. She was a girl, like me, like your daughters. She was erased because she remembered something someone didn't want her to. Another silence, this one heavier. I'm not here to blame. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because she deserves to be seen. Her voice cracked slightly, and because I do too. She stepped back. Done. No applause, just stillness. And then a single hand, raised from an old woman near the front. Wrapped in wool hands gnarled by time. She stepped forward. I remember that name, she said softly. My mother told me stories. She said Eleanor used to sing to the horses, that she could calm even the wild ones. Her voice trembled. She wasn't a ghost. She was real. Emily met her eyes. The woman nodded, and slowly others followed. A man stepped forward with a ledger, one that showed Eleanor's birth listed, then crossed out with no record of death. Another produced an old photograph, a blurred child on horseback riding across the bridge. A local historian confirmed the painting's pigments dated precisely to the year of her disappearance. One by one, the silence fractured. And then, something extraordinary. A woman stepped forward holding her son's hand. My family. We're Whitcombs, she said. We didn't know. We were never told. She knelt before Emily. I'm sorry for what they did, for how long we let them bury her. Her son, a boy of 7, stepped beside her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin horse, worn and scuffed. He placed it on the ground in front of Emily. For her, he said simply. The crowd rippled with something unnameable. Not shock, not awe, something warmer. Forgiveness. The service became something else. Not a lecture, not a trial, but a reckoning. Locals brought letters from attics, faded drawings, half-remembered lullabies that mentioned a girl with a red ribbon. They shared stories, tears, questions. Some stood up and read lines from Eleanor's journal aloud. Others simply listened, eyes glassy. Nora brought out a candle and lit it. And then, one by one, others did too. Within minutes, the green was lit with soft flames. A circle of warmth. Emily stood at its center, surrounded by light, finally not alone. That evening, the gallery unveiled a second frame beside the original painting. A plaque beneath read, Eleanor Whitcomb, 1896 to 1903. Not forgotten, not erased. Her voice lives on. Inside the frame was not another painting, but a mirror, so every person who stood before it would see themselves and remember what was buried, and who brought it back. At dusk, the townspeople returned to the bridge, not in fear but in vigil. They stood along the edges with lanterns, placing flowers in the stone crevices, hanging paper ribbons from the branches nearby. Children sketched the bridge and pinned their drawings to a corkboard left near the entrance. One girl drew Eleanor as a bird. Another drew her walking away from the bridge, smiling. Emily stood quietly at the center again, lantern in hand, this time not to remember, but to release. She stepped to the railing and placed a single ribbon, the same maroon color Eleanor once wore, onto the stone. Then she let the wind take it. And for the first time since all this began, she exhaled, not in fear, but in freedom. Later that night, she and Graham walked home in silence. The village behind them glowed softly, not just from candles, from something else. Hope. Graham placed a hand on her shoulder. You did it. She looked up at him. No, she said. We did. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Blackmore. The bridge was declared a protected site. The gallery expanded its exhibit to include forgotten voices in local history. And at the edge of the chapel green, a tree was planted. Eleanor's tree, they called it. Its plaque read, planted in memory of those we buried too deeply. May they grow in light. One morning, Emily returned to the painting, alone. It had changed again. The bridge still stretched outward, but now the horizon glowed, not with storm, with dawn, and the girl. She was gone. In her place, a path, and footsteps. Moving forward, winter arrived softly in Blackmore, not with the violence of storms or the tyranny of ice, but like a hand on a shoulder, quiet, inevitable, forgiving. The first snow dusted the rooftops like a long-held breath finally exhaled. The sky stretched wide and pale above the chapel green, where an altar had been erected from reclaimed oak, wrapped in ivy, crowned in light. This was not a funeral. This was memory replanted, truth replanted. And today the village gathered not to mourn Eleanor Whitcomb, but to welcome her home. Emily stood behind the altar, her hands gloved but bare-fingered at the tips, so she could feel the wind when it touched her. Around her, townspeople held candles, scarves wrapped high, cheeks pink with cold. No one spoke. They didn't need to. What filled the air wasn't silence, it was reverence. The space between hearts when they beat in unison. Graham stepped beside her and gave a small nod. He'd said nothing all morning, just watched her transform not into something else, but into someone wholly herself. Nora stood at the front row, a sketch pad against her chest. On its cover, a graphite rendition of Eleanor, not as a ghost or a shadow, but a child with bright eyes and wind-tossed hair. Alive, in memory, in legacy. A bell chimed, and Emily began. There's a story they told about the girl on the bridge, she said, her voice steady. That she vanished. That no one knew why. But we know now. She looked out across the crowd. We know she didn't vanish. She was erased. And we brought her back. A pause, breath. This isn't about sorrow. It's about seeing. About remembering the ones we pushed into shadows. About calling them by name. About listening. She reached into her coat and pulled out the journal, Eleanor's voice on brittle paper. We carry her story, not because it's easy, but because it matters. Because no child should have to scream from inside a painting to be heard. Then she closed the journal. We are all bridges. Between what was and what could be. Between forgetting and forgiving. She turned to the oak box resting on the altar. Inside was a ribbon, maroon, weathered. She placed it gently on top of the box. For Eleanor, she whispered. A hush followed deep and wide. Then movement. The children of the town, young and small, stepped forward with pieces of colored cloth. Each tied a ribbon to the altar's frame. Green, blue, gold, crimson. Dozens of them fluttering like whispers in the winter wind. No one directed them. They just knew. And when the last ribbon was tied, the wind rose gently through the green. It wasn't cold. It was soft, as if something had exhaled. The crowd began to hum, not a song, but a sound. Low, unified, woven from generations. And as the sun pierced the clouds for a single golden moment, the altar glowed. Later that afternoon, the gallery doors opened to the public for the first time since the exhibit's transformation. Journalists stood outside, but none of them pushed in. This was not a moment to exploit, it was a threshold to honor. Inside the gallery had been rearranged. The fifth painting now hung in a vaulted alcove of its own. The lighting had been changed warmer like morning light, casting the canvas in a glow that felt more breath than bulb. And the painting itself, it had changed, not visibly, not in the pigments or the brushwork, but in presence. The bridge no longer stretched into fog. It reached toward a field blooming faintly subtly in light. And at its center, not alone, stood two figures. One of them held a lantern. The plaque beneath read, The Fifth Bridge. A portrait of memory. A door once closed, now open. Emily walked into the room slowly, steps echoing across the polished floor. She approached the painting, not as a puzzle, not as a ghost story, but as a witness. She stood before it. She didn't cry. She smiled, just slightly, and closed her eyes. The weight was gone. Not replaced, not forgotten. Transformed. Behind her, people entered in twos and threes. They stood silently. Some stared. Others whispered. A few wept. And every person who stepped into the room seemed to stand a little taller when they left. Stories do that. They bend us, break us, and then if told right, they rebuild. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Blackmore. Not dramatically, not overnight, but unmistakably. The local school added a module on silenced histories. The town archives received grants for preservation. Children painted bridges in their art classes, not gray ones, but bridges covered in leaves and stars and birds mid-flight. The village commissioned a sculpture, two girls holding hands, one slightly translucent, one grounding the other to the earth. It would sit beneath the altar on the green, surrounded by flowering bushes, which the children promised to tend. And once a year they would gather here, not for mourning, for remembering, for healing. Emily returned to the bridge only once more, alone, not to find anything, not to ask, just to walk. She stepped to the center and paused. The wind was light. The water below was calm. She closed her eyes and reached into her coat pocket. Inside, folded and worn, was Eleanor's last letter. She unfolded it. It said only, "If you find this, then I was not lost." She folded it back and let it go. The paper danced down into the ravine like a feather caught in a draft. Gone, but not lost. She turned and walked away. The mirror in her bedroom no longer fogged at night, no longer moved too slowly or too fast. Now, when she looked at herself, she saw exactly what was there. A girl with light in her eyes, with story in her bones, with the past behind her and the future wide open. She wasn't a ghost. She was a bridge, and every step forward lit the world a little brighter.